Hello everyone, this is Mr. Friedhoff. I'm going to be talking about chapter 4, cells, in this video. We just got done with our chapter on macromolecules. These are molecules that are a little bit larger, and they're going to make up the different cells that we're going to be talking about in this chapter. So with that being said, let's get into section 4.1. Before we talk about cells in general, we're going to talk about this gentleman who is named Robert Hooke. He was a scientist back in the 1600s. He used a simple light microscope, and these were kind of new inventions of that time period. What they were using were just different lenses to try to magnify or kind of get more detail or see smaller things. And he was observing compartments in a thin slice of cork. So you can see this is what cork looks like. It's in like in wine bottles or just bottles in general. And if you don't know, cork comes from a tree. It's actually the bark of a tree. And what Robert Hooke was doing was he was observing just different living things. And he was observing this cork one day. He said that the rooms or the small areas, the small compartments in this cork looked like cells, which were the rooms that monks lived in. And monks are kind of religious people who work at like a monastery. And he said, hey, these cells or these compartments look like the cells or rooms that the monks live in. So that's what he named them. He said that these are cells. And then what he did further is he kind of started the thing, the theory called the cell theory. Before we get there, though, take a look. This is what the drawing of Hooke looks like. You can see the different cells of different compartments. This is what cork tissue looks like. You can see those cells or those compartments that he was observing. Now, there are three parts to the cell theory. The first part is all organisms are made of cells. That's kind of obvious. If you're living, you're made of cells. You either have to be one cell, single-celled, unicellular, or multicellular, made of many cells. So again, if you're living, you're made of cells. The second part is that cells are the basic unit of living things. That means that the smallest thing we consider living is a cell. And all cells come from pre-existing cells. That means that if a cell is here today, it had to come from a pre-existing cell from earlier on. Now, these are concepts that we should know today, but they were kind of new and really revolutionary for that time period in the 1600s. We also have these things called organelles. These are specialized structures that give us certain like mini organs in the cells, and they have a specific shape and function within the cell that helps them complete a task. And we're going to be talking about the different types of organelles in each cell in the next couple sections. Hello, everyone. This is going to be the second section in chapter 4. And in this section, we're going to talk about something called the cell membrane. So we've been talking about the cells recently in this chapter, and we're going to be specifically talking about the outside of the cell. It's also called the membrane or the plasma membrane. Now, in each one of these organelles, we're going to talk about the structure, that's the shape of something, and the function, that's the job of something. So the structure here of the plasma membrane is composed of a bilayer of phospholipids. You can see this bilayer, which means there's two layers of phospholipids. Now, we talked about phospholipids a little bit when we talked about macromolecules. Remember that lipids make up the membrane. We talked about that before. And the specific lipid that makes up the membrane is called a phospholipid. We also have these things called membrane proteins. These proteins are going to be found within the membrane, and they're going to help with a lot of different things. Now, we're going to get to that here in a second, but basically, the membrane is made of two specific parts, phospholipids and these membrane proteins. The function is to separate separate the outside of the cell from the inside. So basically, this layer of phospholipids is the outside of a cell. Now, we've talked about these phospholipids a little bit in the past, but let's go over them a little bit more here. The heads are on the outside, the tails are on the inside, and the heads are going to be hydrophilic. If you remember the word hydrophobic, that was what we told you were the lipids. Now, the tails are hydrophobic, which means they fear water or they push against water. They don't like water. And the heads here are going to be the opposite. They're going to be hydrophilic. Philic means that they like. So the water is going to be attracted to the heads of the phospholipids, while the water is going to be pushed away by the tails. And this is, again, due to their polarity. Tails are going to be nonpolar in this regard, and heads are going to be polar. Now, we also have the membrane being flexible, which means the phospholipids here are going to move around. They're not going to just stay static, or they're not going to be rigid. They're not going to stay in place. They're going to be flexible. They're going to move around. They're going to be able to be moved. Now, one more part that we're going to talk about within the membrane is something called cholesterol. And this is a molecule that helps with that fluidity. It helps keep the membrane fluid and not rigid. And this is not talking about when somebody's like, oh, I have high cholesterol. Not talking about that. We're talking about a different type of cholesterol. but this is just within the membrane and it helps with the fluidity of the cell. And we're going to end with a nice meme here. Cell membranes be like, you shall not pass. Yeah, the cell membranes help regulate and stop things from getting into the cell or leaving the cell unless the cell needs them. Everyone, we're going to talk about section 3 here in chapter 4, and this is going to be about what all cells have. Now, one thing that all cells have are the membranes that we talked about in the last section, but in this section, we're going to talk about 2 other things that all cells have. So that first is the cytoplasm. This is just the aqueous liquid within the plasma membrane. This is just the stuff that's in the cell. And it basically kind of holds all the other organelles together. It holds everything between the plasma membranes. And again, this is what all cells have. So you can see this is just the inner portion here of the liquid. Another organelle that all cells have are the ribosomes. Ribosomes are small little structures that are usually circular in nature, but they have many of these within one cell. And their main job is to create protein. So the ribosome is almost like a protein factory. All cells must have 3 things. All cells must have these ribosomes, all cells must have cytoplasm, and all cells must have a plasma or cell membrane. And this is actually the end of section 4.3. Hello everyone, this is going to be section 4.4. This is the 4th section in chapter 4, and we're going to be talking about eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. So these are cells that we should have learned in a previous class, like your middle school science classes, but these are terms that we're going to be using a lot this year. So eukaryotic cells are larger, they are much more complex, they have a nucleus, their DNA is in long strands, and examples are like plants and animals. So these are our cells. We have eukaryotic cells within us, and they make us up. So eukaryotic, think U is yes, it has a nucleus, large in size, and they're complex. Prokaryotic cells are much more simple. They're not as complex. There's no nucleus. They have circular DNA. An example of bacterial or eukaryotic cells are bacterial cells. So these are much simpler types of cells compared to our eukaryotic cells. Now, we do have prokaryotic cells in us, but we're not made of prokaryotic cells. Whenever I think of prokaryotic cells, I think pro is no, and they don't have a nucleus. Now, the main feature here that we talked about before is the nucleus. And this is the circular organelle that holds all of the DNA. This is a defining feature among the eukaryotes versus prokaryotes. And basically the function here is to protect the DNA, protect all the chromosomes, protect all the genetic information of a cell. And it basically serves as like the control center of a cell. And these nucleuses or nuclei have their own membranes. So these are almost like a cell within a cell. But basically, again, the nucleus is a holding spot for the DNA of a cell. And you can see here, one of the things we're going to talk about last is the cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton is a protein network within the cell that usually helps support the cell from the inside. Think cyto meaning cell, and skeletons like your bones. And this just provides a structural support for the cell. So this gives the support of a cell from the inside. And this is something that is, again, found in eukaryotes, not really much in prokaryotes. All right, hello everyone. We're going to do the 5th section here. This is going to be about plants and animals, and specifically their cells. So we're going to be looking at some things that are in plant cells and things that are in animal cells. So without further ado, let's get into mitochondria. Mitochondria are basically they're called the powerhouse of the cell. I don't really like that name just because it's kind of just misleading or just kind of maybe hard to understand. They generate our energy. That's what the whole analogy is. The powerhouse or like the power plants of a city or a state. These are the power plants of a cell, and they have 2 membranes, and they are full of enzymes. And there are many in one cell, and their whole function is to generate energy from the breakdown of food. So they're found in all eukaryotic cells, but they're not found in any prokaryotic cells. So this is a big defining difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes, but these are found both in plants and in animals. And this is what a mitochondria will look like. So basically think of these as the power plants of the cell. This is what is breaking down food and generating our energy. Next are the chloroplasts. These are, again, they have a double membrane. These are more organelles that we're going to find in eukaryotic cells, and they contain pigments that make it green. Now, we don't have chloroplasts in our cells, so we don't have them in animal cells, but we do see them in most plant cells. So these are going to be just places where photosynthesis occurs, and they are going to convert the solar energy into usable energy in a molecule called glucose. So these are just another form of an organelle that plants have that animals don't have, that they're going to use the solar energy to make basically their own food. Another type of organelle that we're going to see in plants that we're not going to see in animals are cell walls. And these are rigid structures made of cellulose, and they're found on the outside of the cell membrane. You can see where the cell wall is. And they basically give the support and structure of a cell. And they're used also for protection. Next, we're going to have vacuoles. These are basically another membrane-bound organelle, and they are just going to be the containers or the storage containers of a cell. So they just store nutrients or store water, and so they can store a bunch of different things, but these are basically just storage centers for the cell. Now, between plant and animal cells, there are a couple of big important things to remember. Plants have chloroplast and mitochondria, while animals just have mitochondria. There's a big misconception in biology that people think that plants have only chloroplast and animals only have mitochondria. The fact is that plants also have mitochondria. Plant cells have cell walls, while animal cells don't. Obviously, we should know that. And plant cells have one large central vacuole, while animal cells have many smaller ones. This will be the last section in chapter 4, and this is going to be about membrane-bound organelles. When we talk about membrane-bound organelles, we're talking about any organelle with its own phospholipid bilayer. You can see here, these phospholipids make up the bilayer or the plasma membrane, and each one of these is going to have their own phospholipid bilayer or membrane. We're going to talk about something called the ER, vesicles, Golgi body, and lysosomes in this section. First, let's talk about vesicles. These are just small little spheres. They're going to transport things around the cell. You can see again, they have their own phospholipid bilayers, and they have their own membrane. So this is just like a transporter within the cell. Now, vesicles are going to be produced by something called the endoplasmic reticulum. This is the ER. We have two different types. We have rough and smooth. And basically, the rough have ribosomes attached while the smooth does not. And basically, this is just, again, a network of membranes. They're going to be found next to the nucleus. Now, their function is to produce things called lipids and to produce things called proteins. We've already kind of seen this, but they produce both of them. And they send them through vesicles to the Golgi body, which we're going to get to next. The Golgi body is also a membrane bound, which again means they have their own membrane, their own phospholipid bilayer. And basically what the Golgi body does is it modifies, it stores, it routes, it tags different things. This is basically just a big shipping center for the cell, where it's going to intake vesicles from the rough ER and smooth ER and kind of ship them back out to different locations around the cell. Lastly, we have lysosomes. These are, again, membrane-bound organelles that contain their own membrane, their own phospholipid bilayer. But basically what these do, they break down things. They're like the janitors or the custodians of the cell. And they use digestive enzymes within their membrane to do this function. So basically, again, they break down food vacuoles, damaged organelles, and even dead cells. Basically anything the body needs to get rid of. And so what they're going to do is they're just going to be like the janitors of the cell.